A reading from Genesis. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. And they said to him, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I've grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Sarah was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Hospitality is a two-way street. I can still recite the poem that taught me what not to do and taught me that manners matter. Let's see if you know this one. "Well, I'm not big on social graces. Think I'll step on down to the oasis. 'Cause I've got friends." Oh, it's a summer crowd. That was really sad. You're Dallas, Texas. Come on. That's Garth. Now, as much as I appreciate Garth trying to teach me to empower me to throw off the shackles of elitism and social convention, at some point, if you want a salary, a social life, or a significant other, you better learn to mind your manners. Sitting on the subway in New York once, I was visiting Nora, and I saw a sign that read, "Please don't clip your fingernails on the train." They needed a sign for that? Like, who's the guy that's like, "But I'm just sitting here doing nothing. Like, why wouldn't I take this opportunity to groom myself in public and save some time in the morning?" And as it turns out, people don't like being poked, even if it's just a piece of your finger detached and hurling like shrapnel at your neighbor. People don't like being poked, so clip your fingernails at home or outside. A lot of people don't know that, apparently. There was another sign next to it that said, "It's a subway car, not a dining car." But this heaping hot bowl of chili isn't going to eat itself. Does anyone out there hate the sound of chewing? It's called misophonia, and it's a real problem. For me, it's the sound of specifically my old roommate eating cereal in an empty room. You know, all that slurping and crunching. It's just awful. It's an awful, awful sound. So it turns out people don't like it when you eat in front of them and don't share. So either share your tuna fish sandwich with your neighbor or find a nice quiet spot to eat it yourself. Because social graces matter. They make us aware of how much space we are taking up in the world. And they enable us to receive each other well as helping us be good guests and good hosts with open hearths and open hearts. Because when we open the hearths of our home, we open our own hearts to be surprised by joy. Abraham reclined under the shade of a mighty oak tree just as the sun sailed past center sky. Attempting to nap, the solar glare still radiated with a dull glow through his eyelids. But Abraham opened his eyes to the sight of 3 strangers who appeared almost out of nowhere. And he rushed to receive his weary-ready guests, and he said, "My lords, if you see fit, let me welcome you to my humble home. Let a little water wash the dust and dung from your feet. Let a little wine wet your whistles. Have a drink. Bake bread. 3 measures of flour should do the trick. Maybe some roasted calf, curds, and cream, cool and thick. My house is your house. Please, friends, rest a bit." Hospitality in the ancient world was a matter of life and death. In a world devoid of 7-Elevens and highway rest stops, if you were traveling through the desert heat and someone wasn't willing to host you, they might be cursing you to your own demise. As a traveler in those days, just like Blanche Dubois, you always had to depend on the kindness of strangers. And aren't we all glad that Abraham welcomed his guests? Because this particular promise of this child to this particular couple gave birth to God's promise of hope and salvation to the whole creation. As the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it." I wonder if Abraham really knew who his guests were, or if this was just how he received everyone who showed up on his land. On the cover of your worship guide this morning, you'll see an icon entitled "The Hospitality of Abraham," which has affectionately become known as Rublev's Trinity. Andrei Rublev was a 15th century Russian Orthodox icon painter, and he gave us possibly the most well-known icon and certainly the most well-known depiction of this very scene from Genesis 18. The 3 divine guests, cloaked in colors to signify which member of the Trinity they are, barefoot because wherever they stand is holy ground, sitting around a common dish given to them by their gracious host Abraham. The truths in Rublev's Trinity continue to leap out to you as you sit with it. But with a text like this, my question and my struggle is always, where is the good news? You know, I've never had an angel knock on my front door asking for a cup of coffee or a loaf of bread. But I have met strangers who spoke a kind word of encouragement to me in an unexpected moment. You know, after all, the Greek word angelos, angel, means a person who is sent with a message. And who of us won't take good news from even a stranger in a dark moment? Or for people whose hope for a family or a child haven't been fulfilled or have never been fulfilled. You know, the Bible, when misread and misused, can quickly become bad news. But we confess a living God who is making all things new And we place our faith in the crucified one who rose from the dead to bring us good news. So what might the good news be in a peculiar text such as this? Back in Genesis 12, Abraham, who was still just Abram at that point, is told by God to leave his father's house in the land of Ur and set out to a land that God will show him. Now remember what I said about traveling in those days. The journey from Ur to the promised land in Canaan was as long as it was treacherous. There was not an interstate highway system connecting sea to shining sea. Ur was an important trading location in the ancient world, situated where the mouth of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers poured into the Persian Gulf. And everything that Abraham could ever want would be back there in Ur. But God made him a promise. Abraham, I want to bless you. I want to give you more children than there are stars in the sky. And you get to really see the inner workings of Abraham and Sarah's relationship here in this text. The strangers show up and Abraham starts placing orders. Bring some water so they can wash. My professor, Bill Leonard, once pointed out that as Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah, he says, make ready 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes. As if this 100-year-old woman doesn't know how to bake bread, right? Abraham, I don't need the recipe for bread from you. What are you talking about? We've been married for 3/4 of a century. I got this. Quit micromanaging me and go get the calf. You can feel Abraham just flutter around the scene with this nervous energy of any host whose guests arrive early, or in this case, completely unexpectedly, almost as if they dropped out of the blue, clear sky. There's an art to hosting, isn't there? A pastor friend of mine once told me about when he went to visit one of the senior adults in his church when he was working in the Mississippi Delta. And she had just lost her husband a few months back, and he was going to come over for lunch. And when he arrived, she had set out all of her finest china, her actual silverware, and linen table napkins. And she cooked him this enormous Mississippi Delta-style hot meal. And he said, you didn't have to go to all this trouble. A cold sandwich would have been just fine. And she told her pastor, I haven't cooked for 2 since my husband died. And you are my guest, and I only want the best for my guests. Because there's a grace in hospitality. Open hearths lead to open hearts. In a pre-industrialized world, the hearth was the center of the home. Around the fireplace, a family would keep warm, they would cook, they would share meals, and they would tell stories. Hearths were the heart of the home. Nowadays, with central heating and air, we can all spread out and claim our own spaces all over the house. My room, my bathroom. We personalize ownership over everything as if it wasn't all a gift anyways. Jacques Derrida, who is arguably one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, was born in 1930 to a Jewish family in French Algeria. Derrida spent his early years as a stranger in a strange land. As a Jewish French Algerian, he experienced vicious anti-Semitism growing up in North Africa. Then, after moving to France, he experienced racism as an Algerian immigrant. And these 2 contrasting experiences of marginalization taught Derrida to ask difficult questions about how language and cultural assumptions function, and how they also fall short. And also about the power of hospitality and the danger of xenophobia, fear of the stranger. Derrida is known as a deconstructionist philosopher because throughout his whole career, he would pull apart ideas and challenge his listeners and pupils to think about how much we assume about the meaning of our words without really considering the mysteries of language and of culture. And in his little text of hospitality, he deconstructs the notion of hospitality to uncover what true hospitality looks like and what it asks of both the host and the guest. Derrida took the expression, "make yourselves at home," and he writes this: "This is a self-limiting invitation. It means, please feel at home. Act as if you were at home. But remember that it is not true. And this is not your home, but mine. And you are expected to respect my property." You see, there is still a responsibility on the part of the guest to honor the space of the host. But the host's task is to create a space of warmth and welcome. To not worry about what the guest does, but to only be responsible for what they do as the host. Didn't your mom ever tell you can't control other people's actions, right? Abraham has no control over who these three characters are. They could be bandits. They could be con artists. They could be something even worse. And yet, he runs to meet them, bows down before them, and welcomes them in with an open heart. And as we soon see in the text, his openness is met with a great surprise. A surprise so bizarre, so miraculous, that his wife Sarah laughs. And as she says in the Hebrew, "I am worn out and my husband is old." But is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? Hospitality is not just about welcoming others into our home. Hospitality, according to Derrida, is about opening yourself up to the possibility of friendship and transformation. Hospitality is a posture of reception, where we open our hearths, our hearts, and our very lives to strangers and others through whom God just might teach us that there really is nothing too wonderful for the Lord. This has been yet another tragic week in our national news cycle. A lone gunman named James Hodgkinson fired 50 rounds of rifle ammunition into a practice at the annual congressional baseball game for charity, where he struck 4 people, including Republican Representative Steve Scalise of Louisiana, the majority whip, a lobbyist from Tyson Food, a congressional aide, and a Capitol Police officer. My friend Aaron Conaway, who is the pastor of 7th and James Baptist in Waco, his father is Pete Conway, a member of the House, who was at that game. And Aaron and his wife Carmen and their kids didn't know until they saw his dad on the news know that he was okay, because they couldn't get through. It was a scary, scary moment. And this was the first shooting of a sitting member of Congress since Democratic Representative Gabrielle Giffords was shot in 2011. And while we search for answers hidden in political motivation to help us make sense of senseless violence, we must remember 2 things. First, hate and violence solve nothing. And this was the heinous act of a broken, unstable individual. Second, these are dangerous times. And something has got to give soon. And when it does, we don't need more violent rhetoric or more grandstanding. We need good men and women willing to beat their swords into plowshares and to continue the important work of peacemaking and collaboration as a country. As Dr. Jonathan Haidt was a professor at the University of Virginia, he wrote one of my favorite books called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. You can't get a book that tells you more what it's about than that right there. And Dr. Haidt and his army of research workers sought to understand the increasing polarization that we feel in our nation today, and they study political trends. And it led them to argue that the two primary political parties in the United States, obviously the Republicans and the Democrats, have not been this divided since the Civil War. This is a sobering moment in the great American experiment. Dr. Hyde also points to a watershed moment in the generation of American politicians where the divide began to expand exponentially. And it wasn't over any particular policy. It wasn't over Reaganomics, it wasn't over gun control, it wasn't over the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The moment where the data showed that the politicians began to pull apart from each other farther and farther and farther was a moment when, at the time, the current sitting Speaker of the House, Gingrich, charged the members of Congress, don't move your families and homes to Washington. But what we're going to do is we're going to change the calendar so we fly in on Tuesday morning until Thursday afternoon, and that's when we're going to meet. And so they gathered together to do battle with each other, with members from across the aisle. So after the short week of warfare was done, they go home to their family in their home district. Makes sense, keep you more in connection with your home district, right? But oftentimes unintended consequences are the most dangerous things. Our leaders were not in each other's homes anymore. They weren't in each other's lives anymore. Republicans and Democrats quit going to barbecues together. Their children no longer attended the same schools. Their spouses stopped having lunch together. They lost the ties of hospitality and friendship that bind us one to another. Now, don't get me wrong. Nothing is ever as easy as just sharing a meal with somebody. Certainly not our current political climate in this country. But getting each other to the table, that's the first step. Because when you sit across a table with somebody, when you break bread with somebody, when you share a meal with somebody who doesn't look like you or think like you or believe like you or vote like you, both parties are transformed, the host and the guest. And the hospitality and relationships that you and I share in our homes, in our school cafeterias, in our office break rooms, it's the very same social grace that makes our government and our world work. It's been working since Alexander Hamilton broke bread with Jefferson and Madison to create a national bank, which moved the capital from New York to the Potomac. And it's the same spirit of compromise and compassion and curiosity that compels countless numbers to commune around common cups and loaves. When we open our homes to one another, we open our hearts to the miracle of hospitality. And friends, miracles happen in those moments because strangers become friends. And friends become family. And when a miracle like that happens, you can't help but laugh like Sarah and say, is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? So who will you invite to dinner this week? Amen.